In the spring of 1846, at a remote fur trading post, a lonely trapper paid $5 for a mute woman. The fort commander said she was simple, harmless, but her silence hid a truth so dangerous it had already left 100 people dead. The trapper was John Callahan, a man who'd spent 15 winters alone in the Rockies. The woman had no name, only the label, the simple one given by Fort Bridger's commander. But in the wilderness, her silence would break. And when it did, Callahan would learn she was the sole surviving witness to the Grattan Massacre, a slaughter the army had declared resolved, but whose real instigator was still out there and still killing. John Callahan's world was one of brutal arithmetic, pelts for powder, meat for months of silence. His cabin, a day's ride north of Fort Bridger, wasn't a home. It was a cache of survival, smelling of peat smoke, cured hides, and loneliness. He came to the fort that spring for lade, coffee, and a single night of human noise in the tavern. He did not come for a wife. Fort Bridger in 1846 was a knot of log walls and desperation on the Oregon Trail. It thrummed with emigrants heading west, soldiers bored into cruelty, and traders eyeing every opportunity. In this chaos, human transactions were mundane. The fort's commander, a Captain Riggs with a waxed mustache and tired eyes, presented her as a solved problem. She'd been found, he explained, wandering half-frozen near the North Platte months prior by an army patrol. She didn't speak, didn't react to questions, just stared. The patrol assumed she was simple, perhaps struck dumb by fever or birth. A nuisance, but a young and able-bodied one. They put her to work in the laundry. $5, Riggs said to Callahan, not as a sales pitch but as a statement of disposal. She'll cook, mend, won't talk your ear off, better than a dog. She stood beside his desk, dressed in a faded calico shift that hung loose on her frame. Her eyes were downcast, her hands clasped so tight the knuckles were white. But Callahan, a man who'd learned to read the subtlest shifts in the wild, the flick of a wolf's ear, the pause in a bird's call, saw something else. He saw the tremor in her wrists, a fine, constant vibration of fear. He saw how her gaze, when it flickered up for a half-second, didn't look vacant. It scanned the room, the window, the door, like a cornered animal calculating escape. He wasn't a charitable man. Charity froze you in the mountains. But he remembered the silence of his own cabin, a silence that had grown teeth since his wife and infant son had been taken by scarlet fever 5 winters back. A silence that wasn't peaceful but hungry. He dropped 5 worn silver dollars on the desk. The coins spun, settled. Riggs nodded, satisfied. The transaction took less than a minute. He led her out to his pack mule, Daisy. The woman followed, stepped silent in the fort's mud. She didn't look back. Emigrants and off-duty soldiers watched, some with pity, most with indifference. One trapper leaning on a post chuckled. Getting lonely out there, Callahan? John ignored him, but he saw the woman flinch as if the words were physical blows. The trail north was a narrow scar through pine and rock. For hours, the only sounds were the creak of leather, the crunch of hooves on gravel, and the wind. Callahan didn't speak. He was waiting, watching her in his periphery. She sat rigid on the mule, her body a locked box. But as the fort faded behind them, as the wilderness closed in, a change began. The sheer terror in her posture didn't lessen, but its focus shifted. She began to watch the forest, not with the blank stare of the simple, but with the acute, recognizing attention of a scout. Her head would tilt at a specific bird call. Her eyes traced a game trail invisible to him. When they made camp by a creek as dusk bled into dark, he finally spoke. "My name's John." He handed her a piece of hardtack. She took it, her fingers brushing his. They were ice cold. She didn't eat. She just held it, staring into the fire he built. "You got a name?" he asked. Nothing, not even a flicker of acknowledgement. He sighed, expecting it. "Suit yourself." He awoke hours later to the sound of a strangled gasp. The fire was embers. The woman was sitting bolt upright, her back against a pine, her eyes wide and unseeing, fixed on the dark between the trees. She was trembling violently, her breath coming in short, ragged hitches. A nightmare. Callahan sat up slowly. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "You're safe, it's just the woods." At the sound of his voice, her head snapped toward him. For a terrifying second, he didn't see a simpleton or a scared woman. He saw raw, abject horror. Her mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound came out. Just a silent, wrenching contortion of her face. Then, as quickly as it came, the mask slammed back down. Her eyes went dull, her body stilled. She curled onto her side, turning her back to him. The performance was over, but the performance had been a revelation. The next morning, a cold drizzle began. They pushed on, the trail becoming a slick trough of mud. Near midday, they reached a rocky overlook. Below, in the next valley, a thin column of smoke rose from a cluster of lodges, a Shoshone winter camp. Callahan tensed, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. Relations were tense, unpredictable. He glanced at the woman, ready to motion for her to stay quiet. He didn't need to. She had gone utterly still, her face pale as ash. She was staring at the smoke, not with fear of the unknown, but with a dreadful, specific recognition. Then her hand lifted, not a wave, not a point. Her fingers curled inward, pressing hard against her own lips, sealing them shut. Her other hand came up and made a short, slashing motion across her throat. The message was archaic, universal, and horrifyingly clear. Silence. Death. Callahan felt a cold knot form in his gut. This was not the reaction of a woman afraid of Indians. This was the reaction of a woman who had seen what they could do specifically. He thought of the Grattan massacre, just last August near Fort Laramie. A Sioux band, provoked by an arrogant young lieutenant named Grattan, had killed 30 U.S. soldiers. The official reports said it was a clean, if tragic, military engagement. But whispers on the trail told a different story of mutilation, of chaos, of a nearby emigrant wagon train caught in the fury. The army, eager to assign blame and move on, declared the matter settled after a punitive expedition. They said there were no civilian witnesses from the wagons. All were accounted for as dead. He looked from the woman's terrified, knowing eyes to the distant smoke, and the pieces, awful and sharp, began to click into place. A woman found wandering months later, hundreds of miles from Laramie, struck mute, terrified of smoke, of uniforms, of speaking. "You were there," he said, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a question. For a long minute she didn't move. The rain pattered on the brim of his hat. Then slowly she turned her head to look at him. The dull, vacant mask was completely gone. In its place was an intelligence so sharp it was frightening, and a grief so deep it seemed to hollow her out from within. Her lips parted. A sound, dry and cracked from disuse, scraped out of her throat. "Yes." That single word, yes, hung in the damp mountain air between them, fragile as a cobweb. For John Callahan, the wilderness had just rewritten all its rules. The woman he'd bought for $5 wasn't a simpleton, she was a witness, and in the West, a witness was a target. He didn't press her, he just nodded, a slow, grave acknowledgement, and turned Daisy back onto the trail, giving the Shoshone smoke a wide berth. They rode in a new kind of silence, one charged with unspoken history. He could feel her eyes on his back, measuring, deciding. The performance was over. The calculation had begun. They reached his cabin as twilight thickened. He lit the lamp, its yellow glow pushing back the shadows in the single room. He moved methodically, building up the fire, setting a pot of beans to warm, laying out 2 tin plates. Normalcy as an offering. She stood just inside the door, her arms wrapped around herself, taking in the cramped space, the stone hearth, the bunk, the shelves of supplies, the absence of anything soft. "You're safe here," he said, not looking at her, focusing on the fire. "Walls are thick, door bolts. No one comes this way unless they're lost or desperate." Her voice, when it came again, was a rough whisper, as if rust had formed in her throat. "They will come." He turned then. "Who?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the rough-hewn table and sat, her movements stiff. She pointed a trembling finger at the pot of beans, then at her mouth. He served her a larger portion than he took. She ate like a wild thing, fast and focused, barely chewing. When she was done, she looked at the empty plate, then at him. "Ilara," she said, "my name is Ilara Mills." The name was a key turning in a lock, a person, not a ghost. "John Callahan," he repeated. "I know," she said, "I heard at the fort." She took a deep, shuddering breath, the first voluntary sound she'd made that wasn't pure fear. The massacre, it wasn't just the soldiers. Lieutenant Grattan, he was a fool. He fired on a chief over a stray cow. But the fury, it spilled over. They attacked our wagon train. The Barlow party, 12 wagons. Spoke in bursts, each sentence costing her. They came at dusk, arrows first, then men on horses, with guns too, not just bows. My father, he pushed me under the wagon, told me not to make a sound, not to move, no matter what. Her eyes glazed, seeing the past in the flames. I heard everything, the screams, my mother, the sounds of cutting, laughter, then a man's voice shouting in English, not a soldier's voice, a trader's. He yelled, "That's the one, the green trunk." Callahan leaned forward. "A white man with the war party." Ilara nodded, a sharp, jerky motion. "He was directing them to our wagon. My father was a merchant. He carried a strongbox for a business in Oregon." She swallowed hard. "The man, he knew about it. He opened the trunk after he took the strongbox. He saw me, my face, under the wagon. Our eyes met." The cabin felt suddenly colder. This was the dangerous truth. Not just a massacre, but a robbery. A white instigator using tribal fury as cover. "He saw you," Callahan said slowly, "and you lived." "He smiled," Ilara whispered, the memory etching fresh horror on her face. "He put a finger to his lips just like this." She mimicked the gesture. Then he turned and said something to the warriors in their tongue. "They dragged the bodies away. They burned the wagons, everything. But they left me there in the open, unharmed. A gift, a message. I don't know. I ran for days. I couldn't speak. The words were stuck, like poison in my throat. Every time I tried, I saw his smile." Selective mutism, a prison built from trauma. Callahan had seen it before in men who'd witnessed too much violence in the mountains. The mind simply walled off the horror, and speech was part of the casualty. "The army patrol found you weeks later," he deduced. "You couldn't tell them what happened. They saw a dirty, shocked girl who wouldn't talk, an idiot." "I was safer that way," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "If I was simple, I was no threat. He thought his secret was safe with a mute fool. At the fort, I heard the soldiers talk. They said the man who really stirred the pot at Grattan, a gunrunner named Silas Rook, had vanished, gone to ground. They think he's dead, but he's not. He's out there. And if he ever hears a rumor of a mute woman from the Barlow party who started talking," she left the sentence hanging. Callahan understood. Rook had left her alive as a calculated risk. A voiceless witness was no witness at all, but a talking one was a death sentence. For her, and now, for anyone sheltering her. The next days were a delicate, silent negotiation. Ilara's muteness retreated, replaced by a wary vigilance. She began to help, not as a servant, but as a partner in survival. She knew plants he didn't, which roots could heal a fever, which berries could kill. She could move through the pines without snapping a twig. She was, he realized, far more adept in the wild than any city-bred merchant's daughter should be. "My mother was Metis," she explained one evening as she expertly skinned a rabbit. "French and Cree. She taught me the woods before she married my father and tried to become a proper lady." There was a bitter twist to her words. Her skills were a hidden inheritance, now her greatest armor. A fragile trust built, not from words, but from shared labor. He taught her to track mule deer. She showed him how to weave a fish trap from willow. They repaired the cabins, chinking against the coming winter. In the quiet hours, she would sometimes talk, letting out fragments of her old life like letting blood from a wound. The sound of her voice, slowly losing its rusty edge, became the new rhythm of the cabin. But the past was a shadow at the door. One afternoon, while checking his trap line, Callahan found something that turned his blood to ice. A set of fresh hoofprints, unshod, circling the perimeter of his clearing. Then, tucked in the fork of a tree at the edge of his property, a small, woven charm of horsehair and crow feathers. It was Shoshone. It was Sioux. He brought it back, laid it on the table. Ilara went pale. "It's a marker," she breathed. A question. They're asking the spirits if someone lives here who should be seen." "Seen by who?" "By them," she met his gaze. Rook didn't work alone. He had allies in the tribes, men who traded guns for furs and didn't care where the guns were used. "If they are looking, and if they find me here," she didn't finish. She didn't need to. The isolation that had once been Callahan's protection was now a vulnerability. No one would hear a struggle. No one would come. A week later, the first direct sign came. Callahan was splitting wood when his mule, Daisy, tethered near the creek, let out a sharp, panicked bray. He grabbed his rifle and ran. Daisy was unharmed but dancing in fright. Carved into the smooth bark of the cottonwood she was tied to was a fresh, deep symbol, a simplified arrow pointing north, crossed by 2 slashes. A threat, a summons, or a warning. He erased it with his hunting knife, his heart pounding. When he returned to the cabin, Ilara was standing just inside, a skinning knife held in a white-knuckled grip. She'd heard, she knew. "We can't stay," she said, her voice flat. "We can't run," he countered. "Winter's coming early. The passes will be snowed in. Out there with no shelter, we're easy prey. In here, we have a chance." "You don't owe me this, John. You paid $5. Your debt is discharged." There was a proud, desperate fire in her eyes. He looked at her, this woman who had learned to be invisible, who carried a massacre in her silence. He thought of his own empty years, the pointless cycle of survival. For the first time since his family died, his life had a purpose beyond mere existence. It was a terrible, dangerous purpose, but it was his. "I'm not paying a debt," he said, his voice rough. "I'm making a choice." The decision changed everything. The cabin became a fortress. They worked tirelessly. He reinforced the door with iron brackets. She helped him build a hidden crawl space beneath the floorboards, large enough for one person to hide. They stockpiled water, food, and ammunition. They established signals, a specific owl call for danger, 2 taps on the wall for all clear. Their partnership deepened under the pressure, a bond forged in shared peril. Then the weather broke. A brutal early snowstorm howled down from the peaks, sealing them in a white, silent world. For 3 days, the blizzard raged. It was a perverse relief. No one could travel in this. They were safe, imprisoned together. On the 4th morning, the storm cleared, leaving a world of blinding white and profound quiet. Callahan was outside digging out the woodpile when he stopped, every sense screaming. The silence was wrong. No jays scolding, no squirrels chattering. The forest was holding its breath. He turned slowly. At the edge of the clearing, where the tree line began, stood a man on a paint horse. He was wrapped in a greasy buffalo robe, his face shadowed by a hood. He wasn't a Sioux warrior. He was a white man, and he was staring directly at the cabin's door. The man made no move to approach. He just sat there, watching. Then he raised one hand, not in greeting, but in a slow, deliberate gesture. He pointed at the cabin. Then he pointed north, back the way he'd come. Finally, he drew the same symbol across his own throat that Ilara had made weeks before. The message was unmistakable. "We see her, send her out, or we are coming in." For a long minute, John Callahan and the rider just stared at each other across 100 yards of fresh snow. The world was so quiet John could hear the creak of the man's saddle leather. This wasn't a raid. It was a message, and messages could be negotiated or they could be refused. Slowly, deliberately, John raised his own hand, not in threat, but in clear, slow motion. He pointed back the way the rider had come, then he pointed to the ground at his own feet. Finally, he shook his head, a single, firm negation. "You leave, we stay." The rider's head tilted slightly, as if considering. Then, without another gesture, he turned his paint horse and disappeared back into the pines, the only sound the soft crunch of hooves in snow fading away. John stood there until the cold bit through his boots. The threat hadn't been withdrawn, it had been acknowledged. A line had been drawn in the snow. Back inside, Ilara was a statue of tension. Who was it? "A messenger," John said, bolting the door. "White man, buffalo coat, didn't say a word." Her face paled further. "Sealer's Rook's herald. He doesn't come himself. He sends others to do his talking and his killing." She sank onto a stool. "He knows I'm here. He's giving you a chance to hand me over, a courtesy." "A threat," John corrected, his voice hard. "One we ignore." But ignoring it required a new plan. Waiting for a siege was suicide. They needed to understand what they were facing. The next morning, under a brittle blue sky, John did something he'd avoided for weeks. He left the cabin alone. He told Ilara to bar the door, to hide in the crawl space at the first sign of trouble, and he set out on snowshoes, not toward Fort Bridger, but toward the nearest place where men who lived outside the law might gather. A prospector's camp rumored to be in the next valley, a place called Slippery Gulch. It was a 2-day trek through deep snow. Slippery Gulch was less a camp and more a collection of filthy lean-tos huddled around a frozen creek. The air smelled of smoke, unwashed men, and desperation. John, with his furs and his rifle, fit right in. He bought a bottle of foul whiskey and shared it with a grizzled old-timer named Haggis, who claimed to have trapped every river from here to the Missouri. John didn't ask about Rook directly. He asked about the Grattan trouble, about gun running. He played the part of a trapper just curious about the lay of the land. Haggis, warmed by the whiskey, grew talkative. "Aye, that was a messy bit o' business," Haggis slurred. "Lieutenant got what was common, but them wagons, that was pure butchery. Word is, the army's happy to blame the Sioux and be done with it. Cleaner that way." "Heard there was a white man stirring the pot," John ventured casually. Haggis's eyes, sharp despite the drink, flickered to him. "Heard that too. Sealer's Rook, nasty piece of work. Used to run guns from Independence, had friends in high places and low. Story is, he had a debt to collect from a merchant in that wagon train. Saw his chance when the lieutenant lit the fuse." "What kind of debt?" "The kind you kill for," Haggis said, lowering his voice. "The merchant, fella named Mills, was carrying something for Rook. A deposit, gold coin, lots of it. Mills was supposed to deliver it to a man in Oregon City, but Mills got greedy or scared or both, decided to vanish into the wilderness with Rook's stake. Rook found out. The massacre, it was his collection agency." John's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a robbery of opportunity, it was a premeditated execution. Ilara's father wasn't an innocent victim, he was a target. The entire Barlow party had been slaughtered to cover one man's debt. Haggis wasn't finished, but here's the rub, friend. After it was done, the army's punitive expedition, they rode out, fired a few shots, burned an empty village, made their report, but old Rook, he didn't just vanish, he got promoted. "Promoted?" John asked, his mouth dry. Word is he's doing the same kind of special contracting for the army now, out of Fort Laramie, finds things, removes problems, a useful man if you don't look too close at his methods." Haggis leaned in, his breath rancid. "They say he's looking for a girl, a mute girl from them wagons, thinks she might have seen his face, wants to tidy up." John thanked him with the rest of the bottle and left before dawn. The new information was a poison pill. Sealer's Rook wasn't just a fugitive outlaw. He was a contractor for the very institution that should be hunting him. If they went to Fort Bridger for help, Commander Riggs might very well hand Ilara directly to Rook to settle some inter-fort favor. They were trapped between a killer and the corrupt system that employed him. He returned to the cabin exhausted, his mind racing. He told Ilara everything. When he got to the part about her father's debt, she didn't cry. She just went very still, her eyes hollow. "He never said," she whispered. "He was nervous all that spring, jumpy. I thought it was the journey." She looked at her hands. "He got us all killed for gold." "Rook got you killed," John said firmly. "Your father's sin doesn't erase Rook's crime." The knowledge changed their strategy. They couldn't appeal to authority. They had to become ghosts. John decided their only hope was to vanish deeper into the mountains, to a high, remote valley he knew from his earliest trapping days, a place called the Stone Bowl. It was a brutal journey, but it was a sanctuary. They spent the next week in a frantic, secretive preparation. They couldn't take the mule, tracks would be too easy to follow. They would carry everything on their backs. They packed only essentials, ammunition, salt, traps, the warmest furs, and as much dried meat and hardtack as they could bear. They would leave the cabin stocked, as if they were just out on a long trap line, hopping to buy time. The night before they were to leave, as a final precaution, John went to check a distant snare. Ilara stayed behind to sew their meager food into hidden pockets inside their coats. He was gone less than 2 hours. When he returned, the cabin door was ajar. His heart stopped. He approached silently, rifle ready. He pushed the door open with the barrel. The main room was undisturbed. The fire was low. Their packs sat by the hearth untouched. "Ilara," he called softly. No answer. A cold dread seized him. He moved to the crawl space, the hidden hatch beneath the rag rug. It was slightly off-center. He yanked it open. Empty. Then he heard it, a faint, muffled sound from the lean-to shed attached to the back of the cabin. A scuffle, a choked gasp. He moved like a shadow around the outside of the cabin, coming to the shed door. He didn't burst in. He peered through a crack in the logs. Inside, in the dim light, Ilara was on her knees. A large man in a buffalo coat, the messenger from the snow, held her from behind, one hand clamped over her mouth, the other pressing a skinning knife to her throat. A second man, younger and wiry, was rifling through their packs, dumping their carefully prepared supplies onto the dirt floor. "Told you she'd be here," the wiry man muttered. "Rook said she'd be with the trapper, simple grab." "Quiet," the man holding Ilara grunted. "Find the strongbox coin, it's got to be here." "It's not," Ilara managed to gasp against the hand. "It was taken at the wagons." "Lying bitch," the man hissed, pressing the knife closer. A thin line of red appeared on her pale skin. "Rook wants what's his, and then he wants you quiet, for good." John didn't think, he acted. He kicked the shed door open, not entering, standing framed in the doorway, both men startled. The one holding Ilara turned, dragging her as a shield. John's rifle was leveled, but his shot was blocked. "Let her go," John said, his voice deadly calm. "Walk away." The wiry man fumbled for his pistol. John's shot was a deafening roar in the confined space. The bullet took the wiry man in the shoulder, spinning him around with a cry. He dropped, clutching the wound. The man with the knife froze, his eyes wide over Ilara's head. He was cornered, desperate. John saw the calculation in his eyes: kill the woman, then try for the trapper. In that frozen second, Ilara did something John would never forget. She went utterly limp, a dead weight. The man, surprised, adjusted his grip. In that fraction of a second, she drove her elbow back into his gut. He grunted, his grip loosening. She tore her head free from his hand, and as she did, she didn't scream. She bit down hard on the wrist that held the knife. The man yowled in pain and reflexively jerked the knife hand back. It was the opening John needed. He couldn't fire. He surged forward, using the rifle as a club. The stock connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening crack. The man crumpled, the knife skittering across the dirt. Silence broken only by the moaning of the wounded wiry man. Ilara scrambled away, her hand to her bleeding neck, her breaths coming in ragged sobs. John stood over the two men, his chest heaving, the smell of gunpowder and blood thick in the air. It was over, for now, but they had just crossed a line. This was no longer a threat, it was a war, and they had left two of Rook's men alive in their shed. John looked at Ilara, her eyes wide with shock and adrenaline. They had planned to run, but now running looked different. They weren't just fleeing, they were leaving a battlefield, and the man who sent these soldiers, Silas Rook, wasn't going to take this lying down. The hunt was now a chase, and the only way out was through. The shed was a tableau of violence. Two men down, the air sharp with gun smoke and the copper scent of blood. John Callahan looked from the groaning captives to Ilara, who was pressing a rag to the shallow cut on her throat. Their plan to vanish had just exploded. They had minutes, not days. "Get the packs," John said, his voice low and urgent. He knelt by the two men. The wiry one was bleeding badly from the shoulder, whimpering. The one in the buffalo coat was unconscious, a nasty bruise already flowering on his temple. John quickly stripped them of weapons, 2 pistols, the skinning knife, a boot knife, and pocketed their ammunition. He used the man's own belt to tie his hands, then did the same for the wounded one, using a strip torn from his shirt as a crude bandage. He wasn't leaving them to freeze, but he wasn't making it easy for them either. Ilara returned, their salvaged packs in hand. Her eyes were wide but clear, focused. The shock was hardening into resolve. They'll come looking when these two don't report back. "I know," John said. "We go now, the stone bowl, no trails." They left the cabin behind without a backward glance, taking only what they could carry. They moved north, into the teeth of the rising wind, using the gathering clouds as cover. John set a brutal pace, following ridges and rock slides where their tracks would be scoured away. Ilara matched him step for step, her breath plumbing in the cold air, her silence now one of concentration, not fear. For 3 days they pushed deeper into the high country. The weather turned, shielding them with a fresh blanket of snow. The stone bowl was a high hidden valley, its entrance a narrow defile that looked like just another rock fall. Inside it opened up, a sheltered basin with a frozen lake, surrounded by towering cliffs. A forgotten trapper shack, little more than 3 walls and a sod roof, leaned against one cliff face. It was desolate. It was perfect. They collapsed inside, exhausted. For a week, they did nothing but survive. They set snares, fished through the ice, conserved their strength. The silence of the bowl was absolute, a profound stillness that felt like the world holding its breath. In that stillness, the tension between them began to shift, to soften. The shared fight in the shed had fused their fates in a way mere circumstance never could. One evening, as they huddled by a small fire, Ilara spoke. "He won't stop, John. Rook, he can't. I'm a loose end. And now so are you." John poked the fire with a stick. "Then we stop him." She stared at him. "How? He has the army's shadow. We have 2 rifles and a hiding place." "We have something better," John said, looking at her. "We have the truth, and we have a witness who can speak." He laid out a plan, not of confrontation, but of exposure. They couldn't fight Rook's network, but they could break it. The key was the strongbox, the gold. Rook thought it was lost or spent, but what if they could prove he stole it, that the massacre was a cover for theft and murder? The army might overlook slaughter if it served a purpose. They would not overlook a contractor stealing from the government or from powerful interests back east. "My father's ledger," Ilara said suddenly. "In his trunk, he kept a book, all his transactions. He was meticulous. If he was carrying Rook's gold, he would have noted it. A receipt, a note, something." "The trunk was burned," John said gently. "The trunk was," she nodded. "But my mother, she was cautious. She didn't trust the wilderness. She sewed a pocket inside my wedding dress, the one I left behind at the fort. She put important papers there for safekeeping. I was wearing it that day." Her voice trembled. When they stripped the bodies, they threw the dress aside. It was just bloodied cloth, but if the pocket wasn't found, it was a slender thread of hope. The dress would be at Fort Bridger, in the laundry or the trash heap if it hadn't been burned. It was a risk beyond reason. Going back was walking into the lion's den. They spent days arguing, planning, circling the impossible idea. Finally, John decided he would go alone. Ilara would stay in the stone bowl, safe and hidden. She refused, absolutely. "It's my proof, my risk. We go together or not at all." He saw the steel in her eyes, the same steel that had made her bite her captor's wrist. He yielded. The journey back was a tense, shadowed mirror of their flight. They moved only at night, avoiding any sign of human life. After a week, they crouched on a wooded ridge overlooking Fort Bridger. It looked different now, not a refuge, but a fortress belonging to the enemy. They waited for a moonless night. Dressed in dark furs, their faces smudged with charcoal, they slipped down to the perimeter fence like ghosts. The fort's laundry was a low, smoky building behind the barracks. The air smelled of lye and damp wool. Through a grimy window, they saw piles of unsorted clothing. John kept watch, his heart hammering against his ribs, while Ilara slipped inside. Minutes stretched like hours. He heard the soft scuffle of her movement, the rustle of fabric. Then a soft cry quickly stifled. He nearly rushed in, but she emerged, her eyes wide in the dark, clutching a bundle of faded, stained calico to her chest. They retreated to the trees. Under the starlight, Ilara's fingers, nimble and sure, found the hidden seam in the dress's lining. She tore the thread with her teeth and reached inside. Her hand emerged holding a small oilskin packet. Inside were several folded papers. One was a water-stained bill of sale for wagons. Another was a letter. And the third was a receipt, signed by Silas Rook, acknowledging the receipt of $1,000 in gold coin from Arthur Mills to be delivered to Oregon City. Dated 2 months before the Grattan massacre. The evidence was real, it was damning. It connected Rook to Mills and by extension to the massacre. But it was just paper. They needed to get it into hands that could not ignore it, hands outside Rook's sphere of influence. Their opportunity came from an unexpected quarter. A new group of emigrants had arrived at the fort, part of a large Mormon wagon train heading for the Great Salt Lake. Their leader, a stern man named Elder Clark, was publicly feuding with Captain Riggs over grazing rights. Clark was outside the Army's chain of command, answerable to his own people and famously incorruptible. It was a desperate gamble. John and Ilara approached the Mormon encampment at dawn, presenting themselves as trappers with urgent news. They were brought before Elder Clark in his wagon. John did the talking, laying out the story simply. Ilara stood beside him, and when John finished, she unfolded the oilskin packet and placed the receipt on Clark's table. The elder read it slowly, his face growing grave. "This is a serious accusation. It implicates an army contractor in mass murder." "It's the truth," Ilara said, her voice clear and steady for the first time in front of a stranger. "I saw him. I am the witness." Clark studied her, seeing not a simpleton, but a woman carved by trauma into something unbreakable. "What do you want from me?" "Take this to Fort Laramie," John said. "To the commander there, or to the territorial governor. Anywhere Riggs and Rook can't intercept it. Get it into the light." Clark was silent for a long time. He was a practical man. Involving himself in army corruption was dangerous, but he was also a moral one. Finally, he nodded. "I will see it delivered. You have my word, but you must leave, now, if Rook gets wind of this." They didn't need telling twice. They melted back into the mountains, returning to the stone bowl. Now there was nothing to do but wait. The wait was agony. Every distant sound was a search party. Every clear day felt like exposure. Weeks passed. Then, one afternoon, a single rider appeared at the entrance to the defile. He was an army courier, but not from Fort Bridger. His uniform was from Fort Laramie. He carried a sealed dispatch. With trembling hands, John broke the seal. The letter was from the office of the territorial governor. It stated that, based on evidence received and subsequent military inquiry, Mr. Silas Rook had been relieved of his contract and was wanted for questioning regarding fraud, theft of government property, and suspicion of incitement to violence leading to the deaths of U.S. citizens. A warrant was issued. The letter thanked the concerned citizens for their information and assured them the matter was being pursued with the full rigor of the law. It was over, not with a gunfight, but with a piece of paper. The system, when forced to look, had blinked. John and Ilara read the letter 3 times, sitting on a sun-warmed rock by the frozen lake. The silence that settled between them was new. It wasn't the silence of fear or of waiting. It was the silence of peace, deep and unfamiliar. "What now?" Ilara asked softly, looking out over the bowl. John followed her gaze. The stark beauty of the place had grown on him. It was harsh, but it was honest. "The cabin, it's burned or taken by now, or watched." He paused. "This place, it's hidden, it's defensible. There's game, water." She looked at him, understanding dawning. "You want to stay?" "I do," he said, "but I'm not buying this time, I'm asking." Ilara Mills, the mute woman sold for $5, the witness to a massacre, looked at the man who had chosen to stand when he could have stepped aside. She saw the lines of loneliness on his face, now softened by a shared purpose. She saw a future, not just a hiding place. She took his rough, scarred hand in hers. "Yes," she said. They built a life in the stone bowl, a real one. They repaired the shack, turning it into a proper cabin. In the spring, Ilara planted a garden in the thin soil near the lake, using seeds she'd saved from the fort's kitchen. John trapped, but more selectively now, no longer just for survival, but for trade for things they needed: books, tools, a proper stove. 2 years later, a lone rider found the defile. It was Elder Clark, the Mormon elder. He came bearing news. Silas Rook had been captured trying to flee to California. He'd been brought to trial not for massacre, but for the embezzlement of army funds and the theft of the gold. The massacre was noted in the proceedings, a dark shadow over the dry financial crimes. He was sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison. The truth had been served, if not fully, then enough. Clark also brought a newspaper from St. Louis. In it was a small article about the Grattan affair, mentioning new evidence that had clarified the role of unscrupulous intermediaries. The Barlow party was listed among the casualties. There was no mention of a mute woman or a trapper. John and Ilara read it by their fire. They felt no triumph, only a quiet closure. The world had moved on, and that was all right. Their justice was the life they had built in the silence of the mountains. As the years turned, the Stone Bowl became known to a few, not as a hideout, but as a place you could go for honest trade, for medical help. Ilara's knowledge of herbs became legendary, or for a story told by a fire. They were never rich, but they were free. And in that freedom, something remarkable grew between them, something that had been planted in blood and fear, but bloomed in trust and quiet companionship. One autumn, nearly a decade after the $5 sale, a U.S. Army survey party, mapping the new territory, stumbled upon the bowl. Their young lieutenant, polite and curious, was invited to share a meal. Over venison stew, he remarked on the beauty of the place and on the unusual partnership of the trapper and his wife. Ilara, her hair streaked with grey but her eyes clear, simply smiled. "We found what we weren't looking for," she said. The lieutenant nodded, and before he left, he offered something. A new map was being drawn. They could have the basin officially, a land claim. Their names on a deed. John and Ilara looked at each other. A deed meant records. Records meant the world knew where they were. John thanked the lieutenant but declined. "Some things," he said, "don't need to be on a map to be real." The officer left, puzzled, but as he rode away, he looked back at the two figures standing before their cabin, small against the vastness of the cliffs. He saw the smoke from their chimney, the neat rows of the garden, the washings strung on a line. He saw a claim staked not in paper but in life, and in his official report he simply noted, "Uninhabited valley, no strategic value." John Callahan and Ilara Mills lived out their days in the stone bowl. The dangerous truth she carried had been spoken, had done its work, and then had been allowed to rest. Her silence, once a prison, had become a choice for a quiet life with the man who had listened for the person behind it. When travelers passing through the high country later spoke of the reclusive couple in the hidden valley, they told stories of a woman who could cure a fever with a handful of leaves and a man who could track the weather in the clouds. They rarely spoke of the past. Their legacy was not in the massacre they witnessed, but in the sanctuary they built from its ashes. A sanctuary that stood, long after they were gone, as a testament to a simple, powerful truth, that sometimes the most dangerous secrets aren't those we keep from the world, but those the world tries to bury within us. And that redemption is not always found in forgetting, but in choosing what to remember and with whom. The story of John Callahan and Ilara Mills fades into the granite and pine of the high country, one thread in the vast, tangled tapestry of the American frontier. It is a story that asks a difficult question: how many other truths were buried not in the ground, but in the enforced silence of those who survived? The West we remember is often a landscape of clear conflicts and loud heroes, but history is also written in the quiet spaces, in the stories that were too dangerous to tell. The silent woman sold at the fort, the trapper who saw a person, not a commodity. Their tale is a testament to a different kind of courage, not the courage of the gunfight, but the courage of patient trust, of speaking a terrible truth when it finally becomes safe to do so. The Grattan massacre and the slaughter of the Barlow Party entered the official record as a tragic, chaotic episode of frontier violence. The neat, military explanation sufficed for the history books. It allowed a nation moving west to comfort itself with the idea of a clear enemy and a resolved conflict. But as Ilara's story reveals, the real history was messier, more corrupt, and far more human. It involved greed, betrayal, and the chilling pragmatism of men like Silas Rook, who understood that the chaos of war could be a perfect smokescreen for crime. This pattern was not unique. From the Sand Creek Massacre to the Mountain Meadows Massacre, the aftermath of frontier violence often saw a rush to create a single, usable narrative. Survivors who complicated that narrative, especially women, children, or those from marginalized groups, were often pressured into silence, by threat, by shame, or by the simple, crushing weight of being disbelieved. Their muteness was not always a psychological wound. Sometimes, it was a strategic survival tool, the only form of control left to them. What became of the stone bowl? The land eventually changed hands, as all land does, but for decades, trappers and prospectors passing through would note the remnants of a garden gone wild, of fruit trees that had no business thriving at that altitude. They spoke of a feeling of peace in that particular valley, a quiet that felt earned, not empty. The cabin slowly surrendered to the elements, its logs returning to the earth. No sign remained that said, "Not for sale," because the people who lived there had never needed one. Their claim was etched in seasons, in healed scars, in a life built after the storm. In the end, the legacy of John and Ilara is not a dramatic courtroom victory or a famous revelation. It is something quieter and perhaps more profound. It is the legacy of a sanctuary built in the shadow of a massacre. It is the proof that a life defined by a single horrific event can be slowly, patiently redefined by the thousand small choices that come after, the the choice to trust, to heal, to plant a garden in hard soil, to stay. Their story reminds us that history is not just about the events that scream, but also about the silence that follows and the rare, resilient voices that eventually break it. It asks us to listen differently to the stories from the edges of the map, to wonder about the truths hidden in plain sight, wrapped in the convenient label of madness, simplicity, or silence. So the next time you hear an old story from the frontier, a tale that seems too neat, too clean in its villains and heroes, remember the mute woman at Fort Bridger. Remember that sometimes the most important truths are the ones no one was meant to speak aloud. Thank you for listening. If you found this journey into the hidden corners of history compelling, make sure to subscribe. Your support helps us uncover more stories lost to time, giving voice to the silences